Story 1. I used to work as a bouncer at a club, and one night, we were covering a gig that the club owner had with his buddy, who owned another joint. The funny thing was, we never even met this buddy of the owner. Anyway, our job that night was to keep a close eye on the security near the front stage. Well, this guy showed up, thinking he could slip past me unnoticed. I had to let him know that wasn't happening. I told him he had to step back and leave, moved back about a foot, but he's still trying to enjoy the show. I gave him a final warning and even said I'd have to personally escort him out if he didn't listen, but he acted like he couldn't hear me, so I had to pick him up and escort him out. As I'm carrying him away, he's yelling my boss's name in a not-so-nice way. Turns out I was booting my boss's business partner from his own event. It was a bit embarrassing, but I didn't regret it because I was just doing my job, and he kinda asked for it. Later that night, about an hour and a half after the show ended, and only 10 minutes after all the action, I had a diabetic seizure. I had been in the sun for a solid 14 hours, and my ability to keep track of my blood sugar levels was completely shot. They had to call the EMTs and all that. When I finally woke up, I felt terrible. And guess who's there, being surprisingly kind and checking up on me? Yep, the same business partner of my boss who I just kicked out of the event. It was sincere. He introduced himself and shook my hand. It was pretty awkward, but I think it showed him that I wasn't just there to look cool. If you're serious about that job, you'd rather stop someone who shouldn't be there than let them in and ruin the night for everyone. Funny thing was, I didn't get in trouble for it, and my boss even seemed to respect me a bit more after that. I'll always remember that night. This guy just showed the other dude that no one is above the rules, even if they are the boss's friend. Respect. Story 2. As an exotic dancer, I had a strange meeting with an older man wearing overalls on my very first night performing. He somewhat lacked dental hygiene, but he was curious about my own teeth. He asked if I had any dental work, and I told him I had one filling, then asked if it was silver or gold. I replied, silver. At this point, he requested to examine my teeth. Being somewhat timid, I obliged. To his dismay, he complained that it was too dark to see properly. Several months later, I ran into the same guy at a different club. This time he came prepared with a flashlight. At first, he seemed interested in a dance, but once we were in a more secluded area, he revealed his true intentions. He just wanted to inspect my teeth. I reluctantly opened my mouth, and he seemed rather bothered by my single filling in a sea of otherwise healthy teeth. He insisted that I find a girl with dental problems, to which I replied with a promise to do so. Then I promptly sought refuge in the dressing room until he left. In addition, I used to have a regular customer with unique preferences. He had a fascination with my armpits and enjoyed receiving kicks in the sensitive area. On one occasion, he even proposed watching an adult film together. The particular video he chose featured CGI representations of Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy, but they both had ding-dongs. Story 3. Probably too late to the party, but I have a few. The stalking dancer. About 3 months after I started working at the club, a particular dancer became infatuated with me. She liked a lot of the same music and stuff I was into at the time, which was different from the typical hip-hop or R&B that most dancers in the club liked. We talked a few times while I was taking a break, but I never really gave her any indication that I was interested, mostly because she was a hopeless and did more than just dance with the customers. She started leaving strange notes at the bar addressed to the hot goth or whatever else she could come up with. At first they were just like, "I want you so bad, I can't stop thinking about you." Then they moved on to, "Every guy I dance for or do extra service to, I picture your face on him and I just can't control myself." Finally, she started leaving notes written in red that said, "I need you right now or I'm going to lose myself." Wow. One day I was at work and the house mom came in and told me that the toilet was clogged and needed to be unclogged. I told her that's not my job and she should do it. A minute later, the manager told me I needed to go and unclog the toilet. I got some gloves, filled up a mop bucket, grabbed the snake and a plunger, and headed to the ladies' room. I opened the last stall and there was no one in it, but it was locked. Okay. I went to the first stall and the door swung open, but there she was, straddling the toilet. I noped out of there instantly. She jumped down, grabbed me, and pulled me back in. I shrugged and told her I don't do that and tried to leave as fast as I could, but in the meantime she screamed, "Whatever then!" I ascertained that there was not, in fact, a clog. I walked over to the dressing room, flipped the house mom off, who was laughing outrageously, and went back to my work. She skulked around for a few more weeks before moving to another victim to stalk, but that was an interesting experience. The brawl. Fights were pretty common at the club, but thanks to our excellent security, they were usually handled fairly quickly. We had a few security guards who weren't very good on their own, but they worked out okay when they were under good management or given good advice. One day we had the dream team of security because a few guards had quit and they had to fill up Friday night security detail. The team included a very white-black guy who was also somewhat of a mall ninja, a person who is obsessed with tactical gear and weapons, even though they have no real training or experience, a short, angry Irish guy who was also a barback, a person who helps out bartenders, like me, a scrawny, bald white guy who had no reason to even be considered a security guard since the manager seemed more interested in paperwork in the office than actually running the place. Anyway, a few men came in that night who I could instantly tell were going to be a problem. They were getting touchy-feely with the girls, shouting, being rude to the waitresses and other customers, and barely tipping. Normally, they would have been easy to deal with, but all of them were huge. I think the shortest was at least 6'6". Their arms were bigger than most people's heads. The girls started asking security to deal with them, but none of the security guards wanted to say anything because the men were getting aggressive. Finally, the mall ninja, the feisty Irish guy, confronted the men and told them they needed to leave. The men did not like this at all. I was in the kitchen cooking some orders when I heard a commotion. I didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe it was one of the rappers making it rain or whatever, but then I started hearing breaking glass and several loud thuds. I was hesitant to walk the now-finished food out, but as soon as I got to the kitchen door, two men burst through, arguing loudly and knocking things over in their path. I dropped the food and did my best to get them out of the kitchen. I stood near the bar and tried to block anyone from getting to the bartenders, but just then, the mall ninja security guard was roughed up by one of the men. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing, so I put the man in a bear hug from behind. Surprisingly, it started to work. Then, out of nowhere, a customer grabbed me, tore me off the man, and started yelling at me. The guy then realized that he was yelling at an employee and apologized. He ran off, leaving me feeling shaken up but unharmed. The door girl pulled me aside and we watched the chaos unfold. The club looked like a scene from a Western saloon in a spaghetti Western, with tables and glasses knocked over everywhere, and random arguments between customers and security. I'm not sure exactly what happened next, but the manager finally decided to come out and help. With the help of the head of security, they were able to calm things down and get the two men to leave. The police arrived quickly and responded to the situation. I had to close the club down after that, and cleanup took forever. Security didn't get fired, but the manager made a point to always have good security on weekends and save the B squad for the weekdays. Story 4. One guy bought 2 dances for me, but then surprised me by holding me and giving me a back massage. He had just been released from prison after 23 years for a serious crime, and despite his claims of innocence, he told me a wild story about being involved in a major car theft operation fueled by snow back in the 1980s. He even offered me $500 to join him in his hotel room for a bubble bath and another massage, but I politely declined. Oddly enough, a fellow dancer I worked with had accepted a similar proposition from him a few nights prior and commented, "He's really not that bad." And there was Big Daddy. He had a challenge hearing, making it nearly impossible for him to understand anything I said. However, he would frequently pass me $20 bills while fervently discussing his fishing tackle business. Oh, and let's not forget the time a guy got his rocks off in his pants during a dance and got upset with me about it. From ex-convicts to daddies who adore fishing like Dreamable, to those who can't seem to keep it in their pants, this girl has seen it all and done it all. Story 5. Funniest, I fell off the pole and hurt my back, but I was dancing for a nice regular and he didn't make too much fun of me. Or maybe the time my work friend and I did a double dance for a guy who DJ'd at another club and all he wanted to do was sniff us in weird places. Good. Hula hooping on stage while it's slow. A sweet 21-year-old guy who paid $200 to tell me how pretty I was for 15 minutes in the champagne room. Getting a guy interested by talking about World of Warcraft. He bought 7 dances. Bad. Guy who touched me inappropriately during a dance. I reacted on instinct and cut his airway, which worked, but I was lucky it didn't escalate the situation and he backed off. You know when you almost get into a car accident and you don't think to beep your horn? I had that, except the last thing on my mind was calling the bouncers for help, and that should have been first. Story 6. I've got a few interesting stories to share from my time at the club. One night a guy came in with his son. After some convincing, he agreed to get a dance. We picked a spot with a good view of the door. About halfway through the dance, a girl comes over, grinning like the Cheshire Cat, and says, "Hi, Dad." The guy just stared at her in shock. Turns out it was his daughter there with her boyfriend and friends. Dad felt embarrassed for a couple of minutes, but then he wanted to take on the boyfriend because he thought he was a real troublemaker. Weird. We also had a regular customer with some unique tastes. He wore a chastity belt with a chain and liked it when we talked about him as a puppy in the third person. Odd preferences, but he was a genuinely sweet man and tipped well. And I've witnessed my fair share of fights. The bouncers at my old club had short tempers, and it was a common sight to see them and the managers getting into altercations with unruly customers. We dancers would calmly sit and watch as the bouncers and managers would brawl with a customer down the length of the bar until they removed him. I even saw a manager use the bouncers like mob enforcers, holding a guy pinned to the concrete outside until he handed over his wallet. The manager helped himself to the owed money and left a $50 tip for the girl involved. It was unsettling how violent things could get, but at least I knew I'd get my earnings if a guy tried to bail. On a sad note, that club eventually closed after a bouncer accidentally caused a tragic incident. It was a really distressing and sad situation, and it caused quite a scandal. Story 7. I had worked at several clubs in my area and returned to work at my favorite. My first night back, things were going pretty well. I got off stage, went back to the dressing room to get a piece of pizza and sat down. One bite in, the door burst open with 2 bouncers carrying the limp body of a dancer. As they laid her out on the ground, they explained that she was likely kicking the bucket after shooting up. The house mom and I started to tend her. Luckily, we had a dancer named Dr. Dumb on duty who had just gotten off stage. We were all confused, so the house mom started checking on the dancer. She opened her eyes and shone a light in them, but there was no response. The dancer was no longer breathing and had no pulse. Dr. Dumbass said, "She's not breathing. Let's give her water," and poured water on the limp girl's forehead like she was the Pope. The house mom took the water from her and told me to keep an eye on the girl as she ran to make sure help was on the way. We couldn't really give her CPR because she was foaming in the mouth and we didn't want to force it into her lungs. I'm a dancer, not an EMT, so I didn't know what to do. Finally, the manager came back and took control of the situation. Paramedics arrived quickly and started CPR. They gave the girl Narcan to revive her and then took her away on the stretcher. This all happened in about 5 to 10 minutes, but it was wild. The girl survived, but my pizza got cold. I'm glad the girl got a second chance at life, but not so sure about that pizza turning cold. I'd be heartbroken if it was pepperoni. Hey, if you enjoyed these wild nightclub stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Story 8. One night, a guy came in and booked me out for an hour. It's an Australian club, so it cost him $650. He spent the first half of the hour stroking my armpits and the second half having me stand in a footstool and pose like a Roman statue and hold it. It wasn't creepy, just a kooky old guy. Another night, a guy wandered in. He seemed pretty normal, and I was chatting to him at the bar when he turned around to look at the stage. I noticed that he had a massive gash down the back of his head. Turns out he had been hit by a car, woke up on the side of the road with no memory, and wandered into the club for a drink. Autopilot does weird things to people. Story 9. I worked in a nightclub with a unique setup. There was a catwalk-like extension to the stage, complete with a spinning pole at the end. The design wasn't ideal, though, as the space around the pole was quite cramped. This resulted in me accidentally kicking a few people in the face while performing pole tricks. Surprisingly, about 80% of them would actually apologize to me and leave a tip for what they perceived as ruining my flow. I always found this humorous. The worst part of the job was getting puked on while giving a dance. I was covered head to toe and the person didn't even apologize. Story 10. I worked as a bouncer and barback for a few years at a bar. We had a few scuffles, which you never wanted to happen because it bursts a fantasy bubble, and everyone clears out. There was also a fair share of drama between the dancers. However, amateur night was usually a blast. It was especially amusing when your old high school crushes would show up and give it a shot. Typically, amateur night involves dancers from other clubs coming in to compete for a prize. But sometimes, we'd have genuinely inexperienced girls trying their luck to see if this might be a career they're interested in, or perhaps just a chance to pocket a quick $200. Story 11. Former exotic dancer for 6 years. I never really saw anything happen, just once. But probably the times men have handed me $100 for nothing just to show off their wealth. This is in addition to spending hundreds more on me for dancing. I also worked at a club where it wasn't unusual for men to come in and get favors for $10,000 on a freaking Wednesday and charge it to their business account, which is just wild. But the wildest thing is that once a year, the club had a Wild West night complete with a living petting zoo and pony rides, which was freaking insane, but everyone acted like this was normal. This was downtown in a city where the parking lot was next to the city jail. Story 12. Customer got excited after I kissed him through his pants. I was flattered. Customers paid for a VIP dance just to have a conversation. This can be either fun or boring, depending on the guy. I saw a couple of guys playing chess in the club. They never bought dances, which was strange. Maybe they were just looking for a challenge and wanted to see if they could stay focused on the game while surrounded by beautiful women. The clapper. A customer would come to the stage and watch and clap rhythmically to our stage routines. A customer brought me flowers for my birthday. Sweet gesture. Story 13. This is a peculiar story. I only worked as a bouncer for about 4 months. Once we had to kick a college kid from a fraternity for hitting on the bartender and trying to start fights. Later, he returned with his father and grandfather, both dressed in expensive suits adorned with a lot of jewelry. I recognized a few faces in their entourage, and I knew they held high positions in one of the major biker gangs in the city. I genuinely thought we were in for some deep trouble. What were we supposed to do, pick a fight with the bikers? They pretty much controlled the nightlife around here. Should we inform the local police? They wouldn't arrest the bikers. They were all on their payroll. To my surprise, the father pulled me aside and asked politely what had happened to his son. I explained that he had been pestering the female staff and starting fights. I braced myself for a physical altercation, but instead, he slapped his son right in front of me and made him apologize. Then the father thanked me for how I handled the situation and said, "You probably know that most bouncers in town are prospects for a club, so they won't lay a finger on my son. If they weren't, they'd teach him a lesson. You didn't know who my son was and you treated him with respect. Have you ever considered working as a bouncer at some of the better clubs around here?" It was essentially an offer to join their club. After that night, I had an epiphany and decided to quit my bouncing job. Many bouncers indeed have ties to gangs and criminal activities, and I didn't want to get involved in that world. I'm actually surprised I got the job in the first place, as I have no connections to any gangs. What stood out most about this incident was that, despite my initial fears, the entire conversation was quite sophisticated. Story 14. Oh, this is a question I can answer. I'm a dancer and I've been doing it for a few years now. I had a customer come in and pay for 60 minutes in the champagne room just so he could give me a back massage the whole time. And I'll never forget this one customer. Another chatty, middle-aged customer paid for 30 minutes in the champagne room, and 10 minutes into it, we were no longer dancing and he was having a serious discussion with me about investing in the stock market. I actually learned a lot from him, but the most memorable thing was a full-out brawl involving most of the club. A customer assaulted one of my coworkers on stage, and things escalated quickly. It was a group of rude customers against some of the dancers, and then eventually, more people got involved trying to break up the fight. It was the first fight I'd ever been in, and I'll never forget it. An exotic dancer's life is like a box of chocolates. Sometimes you get a generous tipper, while other times you get customers who think the club is a WWE ring. Story 15. Former dancer here. I once had a guy pay for an hour in the private room. We just sat and chatted most of the time. He told me about his son who had a disability and about his wife being a full-time caregiver for their son and her mother. Then, out of nowhere, he offered me $500 to step on him. Another one who was a regular was a guy who liked to draw. He would always come in with a tiny scrap of paper and sketch me. He was a really nice guy who taught me a lot about art and how to appreciate the beauty in different things. Story 16. As a current dancer, I've got some interesting stories to share. We have a regular customer who used to be a male dancer. Now he pays us for the privilege of giving us lap dances and tips generously. Once there was this young guy who tipped me with origami dollar bills, including a swan, a heart, and even a $50 ring that I proudly wore all night. On a Friday night, Ski Mask the Slump God visited the club after a nearby concert. They brought along a whopping $10,000 in $1 bills, covering the entire club floor. Towards the end of the night, there was this guy who was clearly feeling the effects of something. He asked if I'd sell him some dirty underwear. I ended up selling him a pair of mine for $400. Story 17. Bouncer here. Had a guy have a psychotic episode, steal a car, steal a loaded .45, and come to my bar talking about how he learned that he was God and could take anything he wanted. He proceeded to run to the back of the bar to the Christmas tree, December 2018, and start opening presents that a motorcycle club had left for their party that was going to happen that night. He was arrested shortly after. I know to call them motorcycle clubs now. I guess it does make sense that the word gang gives a lot of good people a bad rap as soon as you say it. But they are actually all super great guys. Very involved with the community, couldn't say a bad thing about any of them. They have their yearly Christmas party with us every year. Thanks for helping me learn something today, everyone. I'm a bouncer for a bar, not a club. Forgot to mention that. Blood thought he was a demigod, but he didn't have divine intervention when he opened that Christmas present and got arrested. What a shame. Hey, did you enjoy these stories? If you do, then don't miss What Thing Gets Girls Super Turned On? Story 5 is insane. See you there.